The first thing I ask every single person that
Mhm.
comes onto a podcast that I do is, can you please introduce yourself for our listeners today?
Yeah. So my name's Alan Dang. I am currently a producer at Meta under their Reality Labs group, working with third-party game studios to make games for the VR Quest. Before that, I have spent about 12 years now, actually over 12 years now, working in the game space, going between educational games and as well as sort of traditional entertainment games. So I've worked on projects with a company called Amplify in the US, which had partnered with game studios such as Bosa Studios, Shell Games, and the like on educational products. I've also worked on traditional games like Killer Queen Arcade, which is a 5-on-5 arcade game here in the US. And yeah, I've just been kind of in and around the industry trying to help folks try to make games as good as they can be, regardless of whether or not they're, well, all games are trying to teach something. But, trying to work with, games that are for all ages and all audiences.
Right. I mean, I love kind of hearing that you've been kind of filling with that line of like education and non-educational spaces. And so, as someone who's kind of been in dipped their toes in both those waters, what is that line? Is there actually a line? What does that look like?
Honestly, I don't think that there's a line. I think that some people want to draw that line in order to, I don't know, define as part of a marketing kind of buzz, or trying to get folks who are trying to, I don't know, for relatively arbitrary reasons. I mean, we look at games nowadays like Minecraft or Roblox that can teach concepts like problem solving or group activities or even basic programming. And then on the other hand, there are games out there that tout that they are just focused on educating kids or whoever on these things. But the reality is that, from a gameplay perspective, they shouldn't be any different. They should both be fun. They should both be able to allow people to experiment and pick up new skills that they can apply in other parts of their life.
Yeah, I mean, I would fully agree, but I guess my question for you there is then why do educational games struggle so much?
Um, I think that there's a bunch of things, and I think I wrote that in a sort of little bit of a rant to you when you had asked me to submit a statement, and it kind of ranges from the challenge of the fact that in traditional games, if I wanted to buy a game, or say if I was younger, I would ask my parents to buy a game, and they would look at it and think that, oh, this is for entertainment value. But when I try to buy something that or when I get something that's supposed to teach me something, oftentimes, the kids don't really know that the game's educational. They just want to play something that's fun. Parents are the ones that are going to be buying that game. And so there's that sort of disconnect where the thing that you're selling, the audience that you're selling to is not actually going to be the end user at the end of the day. And so oftentimes, parents want to buy something that provides the most value in terms of the educational aspect without really understanding the fact that the educational aspect and the gaming aspect should go hand in hand. Otherwise, the kids are going to be like, well, I'd rather play a different game, or, this game doesn't teach me anything, but I'm going to play it because it's fun anyway. So that's one of the many challenges that I feel like I've seen in my time working in both spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like the audience that you're trying to target is weirdly fragmented between like you're trying to design a game for these kids, but you have to sell it to adults. And so do you find that there's kind of like a lack of literacy or understanding from a lot of like parents and or teachers in terms of like what would make a good game to teach about stuff?
I mean, I think there's definitely a lack of gaming literacy. I think in older audiences, and I feel like that's something that hopefully over time we sort of eventually overcome. I was talking to ages ago. I was talking to someone, and I don't remember who, but they pointed out that essentially, like 50 years from, I guess, back then, so 40 years from now, the likelihood of a president or a senator or someone very high up who would have grown up playing video games and understood that gaming literacy isn't unrealistic. Someone playing Among Us now could potentially be the next president. Not the next president, but president. Down the road when they're
I mean, they were,
legally.
we had politicians streaming it, right?
Exactly. So the times I think are starting to change, but I think that at the same time, like we also don't do a very good job of I guess teaching. So like having parents understand like what is it that my child needs to know. Where there's in some ways I feel like there's a lot of fear mongering in the educational sort of materials space where they're like, you need this thing, otherwise your child isn't going to learn about this concept. or they're going to be struggling in this in school, so you need to get this. And I think there's got to be a better way to advertise or promote this or discuss this in such a way that we can talk about what is it that they need to learn and how do they learn that stuff, and then allow parents or teachers to be able to find the materials, the supplemental materials like games and activities like that, to be able to provide for the kids to be able to consume and learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it really nicely, but I also want to just kind of sit on that a little bit more of like, it isn't just the parents and the teachers. I mean, the industry alone has its kind of challenges and issues around the creation and implementation of educational games, no? And like, what do those look like?
I mean, can I swear on this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
100%.
I'll try not to, but
the massive blue stream.
Yeah, no, the thought just occurred in my mind. I was like, I should have asked before. I think that the sort of nature of the business is kind of it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Like, a lot of times when you start up an education, like if you're doing educational games, you can try to sell to parents, but you're competing against basically every other diversion that a kid has available to them. You're competing against YouTube, games, kids, other activities outside of school, and so it's very challenging for a new up and coming learning game studio to really be able to put something out there, because they have the added challenge of not just trying to make a good game, but also trying to make something that teaches you something and being able to prove that thing is that that information is being absorbed by their audience, and then selling to schools. Traditionally schools have a very rigorous process and system to be able to look at the materials and determine whether or not those materials are going to be good for that curriculum. And, a lot of game studios, let's be honest here, like a lot of the game studios are made up of folks who don't have those connections, that they may be young and ambitious, or they may have just been focused on making entertainment for so long that they don't have these kinds of connections to be able to reach out to the appropriate school administration to be able to say, hey, this game that we made teaches this thing. Let us sell this to you guys as a supplemental material for your kids to be able to take and learn and play with and be able to test better with,
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you kind of laying it out in those different kind of avenues that we're kind of struggling through. And I know that we're going to hang on that a bit more tonight in the panel. So I want to pivot a little bit, because you're doing work in VR. And I feel like that's a space where people are always like, oh, VR, like, we can experience things in people's shoes. They can be empathy machines, as a term that we've even heard around. And so like, where do you see the potential of VR for education in a games kind of perspective?
I think that I would say that the evangelist in me will say that there's unlimited potential, that there's more potential than the previous phases that we've experienced of like new technology, right? Like 10 years ago, people were saying that, oh, iPads and portable displays will be the future of education. Every kid will have a tablet. And, that era kind of came and is kind of around, but not really. And, before that, yeah. And before that was the era of like, oh, TVs will teach kids everything. And then, I suppose if we go back really far back, books will teach everything. I think that in the VR space, we have an opportunity to be able to, immerse people in something where now not just your visual sense of reading something where you have to think about it, you're now in this space that will allow you to be able to experiment, problem solve, with very little consequence in the real world. Like that's one of the fun things with VR is that, I can feel like I'm in a scary game, or if I'm driving a really fast car, if I crash, or if this monster kills me in the game, it doesn't affect me. But like all of my senses, my sight, my hearing, and even my physical in some ways is being affected by this, but I'm going to be safe in the long run, but it's still, immersive. My personal dream is, something, I mean, a lot of people talk about the idea of like a holodeck, but there's also this idea of this system. There's a book that I read when I was a kid. Well, no, it's Ender's Game but like one of the things that they had was that there was a system that was like a learning system that would grow and evolve with the person as they learned more things. And I was always fascinated about it because it was this alternate world that the kids would be able to go into, and it would be tailored and customized to every child. And of course, the story is focused on the whole alien combat thing, but it was a place where, like, again, I think it was all immersive, all virtual reality. but it was a different world that the player can go in and try stuff and do things where they were going to be completely safe from. But it's there's just something about the fact that, like, with a book or with any sort of device, if I look away, I'm no longer focused on this thing. But when you're in virtual reality, you can't look away from it. You're just in there until you choose to physically leave it. So there's just something really interesting about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like the way that you put like you can't, I mean, you can escape by taking off the headset, but like you're much more immersed in what you're doing. And so with that in mind, would you kind of separate like VR educational products from like educational games more broadly? Like, do you see that kind of being like a big point of difference?
I think that there's already a sort of big separation. I mean, like, VR headsets, they're definitely more affordable now than they've ever been, but they're still very pricey. You can make the same arguments again with mobile technology. iPads back then were really expensive. Nowadays, with a lower cost iPad or tablet, you can still have video, rich media on those devices too. So potentially that could be a matter of cost. I don't think that there's necessarily a gap. I guess the only difference is that, like, my whole personal experience is that I'm big on multiplayer experiences. Again, I worked on a competitive 5-on-5 arcade game. I worked on a fighting game in the past. I'm always about having people collaborate in a space, either cooperatively or competitively, and learning from that. And so I think with VR, like, imagine being able to put a group of kids, like, Magic School Bus style, like traveling to places in virtual reality and being able to, like, see and learn from each other and see what's going on. I think that that's the place to go. In terms of, like, oh, sorry, I'm drifting. Going back to your original question about splitting this up, I don't think so. I think that, and again, this kind of goes down to everyone's individual, like, philosophy on education. I still see in general, virtual reality game or learning games or iPad games or any sort of game right now being sort of supplemental to the core curriculum, where the motivation is that the kids are going to pursue these things outside of the classroom because they would allow them to be able to either apply things that they learned in the classroom or be able to extend the things that they've learned. I still think that the classroom should be the focus of where kids are going to be learning stuff. But again, kids only spend what, 8 hours? Well, I forget the time now, but something like 8 hours a day in the classroom. But there's 24 hours in a day, and kids, again, outside of school, if they're not learning, then they're not progressing. So being able to take up that extra time outside school playing video games, learning something around it, that can only add to the amount of content that they would be exposed to.
For sure. And so I wonder how you feel about, like, because when you talk about educational games, you have like the companies who are purely educational game companies, and then you have large companies like Meta. And I know that you probably can't speak to Meta's practices, but like Meta or Ubisoft, right, with like their Assassin's Creed museum tours, who are making like educational products within their commercial titles or commercial kind of ventures. And so do you feel like that that's the space to move forward with, like that we should be using kind of like the large companies, or are there other kind of challenges that we should be thinking about in that?
I think that's definitely one of the places that we can go. I think that honestly, it should be a sort of shotgun approach in terms of like trying different avenues and different approaches still. Again, going back to one of the original questions you had asked me about, the sort of challenges of getting these kinds of materials, content into schools and into homes. If we can show people that there are alternatives, that there are what's the word I'm looking for, that there's alternatives, that there's other materials that they can supplement with, and that they can see the value of. I think that it's definitely worth it. In terms of what those things are, I think we're still very early on in figuring out exactly what those things are. But I think that there's enough, like, that I think people should definitely try as many things as possible. Obviously, in the case of things like Ubisoft, they've leveraged a lot of the content that they've already created. And I think that that's definitely one approach. But again, not everyone's going to be a, $100 million blockbuster game. And then on the other hand, like, there's a lot of organic stuff. I would love to see an educational game go the way of, like, Among Us, for example. Like, Among Us was a game that was actually had existed for a few years before it became viral, before an influencer had picked up on the game and it became a thing. I would love to see an educational game go that route because it's much more organic, and that there's potential for virality without forcing the game developer to spend all this marketing money or, make these kinds of connections.
Yeah, I love that. And I have one kind of like closing question for you just for the purposes of time. So I'm
Mhm.
sorry for like the quick transition, but
Yeah.
I've titled the event, right, The Bad Game Arcade. And I know that
Mhm.
you have many feelings about games as good and games as bad. So when I use the term bad there alongside games and education, what do you think about or what do you worry about there?
I think it was Jesse Shell that really kind of hit it home for me. He kept referring to things as chocolate covered broccoli. In fact, I think one time, it's been a while, and one time he did serve me chocolate covered broccoli, which does not taste good at all.
Not like you
um
want it to? No.
no. And I think that that's kind of where, like, you have these sort of ideas of gamification, but they're just done so horribly where, like, you see exactly what they're trying to do, and suddenly the game loses all sense of intentionality or purpose. And you're just like, this is just basically skill and drill. This is just practicing. I'm not really actually having fun. I'm just doing something that feels like a game, but it's not really a game. And I think that's for me, that's the worst one when I look at kids games that just come down to just flashcard reading or just
Yeah.
like memorizing something and then repeating it back. Like there has to be a lot more. There has to be a way to make that a little bit more fun and entertaining without just simply throwing lights and pictures and sounds at you, and things like that.
No, I mean, I fully agree. And I think that's one of the things that keeps coming up kind of across the conversations I've been having is that a lot of people who are in the space are really sick of like those models still getting pushed and
Mhm.
made and produced.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll talk on that a bit more tonight when we kind of talk about the industry versus the academic or educational spaces that are also making games and kind of the challenges in both. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Mhm.
Thank you for, sharing your opinions and thoughts on this podcast episode. And I look forward to talking to you later this evening.
Cool. Awesome. Happy to be here.